when armed guards are mixed with angry civilians, it wasn't long before the crowd are fired on. No one knows who gave the order or fired the first shot, but we do know the first protester to die, a black man. The authorities justified the shooting by claiming that they feared for their lives, that it was the crowd's fault for gathering unlawfully. In the court case that ensued, all but two of the security forces were found innocent of any wrongdoing, and a wave of unrest began to spread across America. The year was 1770. The authorities were British soldiers. The protest would later be known as the Boston Massacre, and the first casualty of the American Revolutionary War was a black man named Crispus Attucks. And we are talking, and by 1770 and the Boston Massacre, the situation was already rapidly spiraling out of control for British authorities. In 1773, 3 years later, we had the famous Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty, an American patriot organization, dressed disguised as Native Americans, dumped crates of tea into Boston Harbor to protest new taxes. And the 1767 Restraining Acts and 1774 Intolerable Acts, as they were called, designed by the British government to punish the Americans for resisting what was going on in America at the time, which we'll talk about in a second, were insufficient. And by 1775, there were battles being fought in the streets of America between local colonial militias and the state army, the British Imperial Army, the Redcoats. And in 1776, the American Continental Congress would declare independence. But let's dial the clock back, because we've got ahead of ourselves a little bit, starting right in media res, if you will. And let's think about let's just take a bit of a broader view on things. And this talk will seek to answer three questions. Firstly, why did people want revolution? Secondly, what kind of person, who was it that wanted independence from the British Empire in America? And thirdly, how has the American Revolution been understood in popular culture? And the vessel for answering that question, the specific case in popular culture we're going to look at, will be the musical Hamilton. And let's start with the first question. Why did people want independence? And out of interest, the first picture we have here was the American patriot Hercules Mulligan and his slave called Cato, who was the slave and the patriot as well. Both of them were very important spies for the American independence movement, who spied on the Brits a lot. So let's answer this question with our picture of the Boston Tea Party. Why did people want independence? Well, to understand that, given the classic historian's argument, we have to go back. For centuries now, the previous talks have looked at colonial British America. There had been a state of salutary neglect. And what that means is that the British government tried to govern as little as possible the American colonies. They basically let them look after themselves. They passed barely any laws. And where they did pass laws, for example, the Navigation Acts in the 17th century, they didn't really enforce them. The Navigation Acts made it so that the American colonies could only trade with Britain itself, and then Britain would trade with the rest of the world. The Americans just broke those laws and smuggled, and the Brits didn't really try to stop them at all. So this changed when in the 1750s and 60s, there was what was called the 7 Years' War between Britain and France and Spain. And it was this very big war that's not really important for our story right now, except for the fact that it was very, very expensive. And the Brits were worried that the war would leak into the New World. There were French colonies and Spanish colonies that bordered the British colonies of America. And they were worried that they'd be invaded and they'd lose all their land. So they raised armies and built border forts to protect the American colonies. And these cost quite a lot of money. And the Brits decided that the Americans should pay for it. So they raised taxes and duties and tariffs. For example, the stamp duty, I want to say in 1767, which put money on all paper moving through the empire. Very, very unpopular for reasons that are complicated, and you can ask me later if you want. And so what the Americans were fighting against wasn't centuries of continuing British oppression. It was that they had comparative autonomy, and they were worried about losing it, as there were more soldiers walking around the streets these days, and there were more taxes being levied against them. That was one part of it. Another part of it, which Simon Sharma argues for in his book, Rough Crossings, Britain, the Slaves, and the American Revolution, where this historian argues that, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, that court case in Britain in 1772, where that guy had brought his slave to Britain, and then the enslaved person, John Somerset, had ran away, and he had tried to re-enslave him, and the court had ruled that he couldn't do that. Do you remember that? Well, news of that court case spread to America. It spread to the white and the black populations of the country. It spread like wildfire, particularly amongst the enslaved population. And they began talking to each other and saying, hey guys, the Brits are freeing slaves. This is not the intent of the court case at all. In fact, the Lord Chief Justice who made the ruling said, no, this is just a specific institution. You know, the rule is that you can't re-enslave someone who took their own freedom on British soil, yada, yada, yada. All those parts of it were ignored. And what the enslaved people in America heard was the Brits are freeing slaves. And in the years to come, thousands and thousands of enslaved people would just start leaving their plantations. And this freaked out the Americans quite a lot. And that was like one part of it. They were worried that popular opinion in Britain was moving towards anti-slavery, and this would become more and more true as the years went on. Secondly, in 1763, there was the very inventively named Proclamation of 1763, where the Crown declared that the American colonies couldn't expand westward into the Ohio River Valley. They had to stay where they were, because the Brits had made treaties with various Native American tribes and nations. And the Americans didn't like this. They wanted to expand their plantations with quite a lot of slaves in them to the west and across America. They wanted more land so they could make more money. And they didn't like this at all. And in fact, finally, once the American Revolution kicks off and the war really starts in earnest, it became British policy to promise any enslaved person that fights for the crown their freedom afterwards. And in the words of Edward Rutledge, who was a South Carolina patriot, he described this British strategy of arming freed slaves as working, quote, more effectively to work an eternal separation between Great Britain and the colonies than any other expedient could possibly be thought of. So the Americans really, really didn't like this pesky British policy of freeing enslaved people. And the final point to make is, when we talk about why the Americans wanted independence in Britain, is, did they? It's a classic thing that you see happen in essays and stuff. They always tell you, take away the first word of the essay question and try and answer that as well. So not just why did they want independence, did they want independence? In the last 30 years, there's been this new wave of historiography. So what kind of history is being written? Which argues that the Americans kind of blundered into revolution by accident. And in the years leading up to the American Declaration of Independence, that wasn't what they were trying to do. They weren't moving towards liberty and freedom this whole time. They just wanted to stop the Brits from oppressing them, from passing new taxes against them, from quartering British troops in their houses. All they were doing is fighting against that. And as they were stumbling towards fighting against that and fighting against that and fighting against that with guns, before long, they realized the only way they could do that was by being independent. So maybe we can answer that question of why did they want independence? Well, actually, did they at all? Or was it more this kind of really complicated socioeconomic, political thing that just pulled apart Britain and her colonies? A thing to think about, at least. But let's try and answer this core question. Because you said that they were fighting for freedom from Britain. Well, what did freedom mean exactly to the Founding Fathers? And Edmund Morgan, the historian, in his book, American Slavery, American Freedom, seeks to answer this question. And he argues, to my mind, very persuasively, that the definition of liberty for the American patriots was much narrower than the definition that we like to use in the modern world. And liberty refers to property in this period. Liberty is the freedom to own property. And that property means two major things: land and people. This is not a kind of liberty that we recognize necessarily in the modern world, but to them, liberty and owning stuff were inexorably and very, very importantly intertwined. Why? Well, if you own a lot of property, You are independent and you're not in debt. You don't need to work for another person to survive. You are economically free. You have your own independence if you have a lot of property. That's one really important part. Secondly, you have a much bigger stake in the country if you have property. Say, for example, your nation loses a war and they lose loads of territory to the victorious power, right? You care a lot more if you own land, that might be land that you lose, than if you don't. And the same goes for, say, if taxes are levied. Almost all taxes in this period were land taxes. If you didn't own land, you didn't care. So the argument went, you needed to own land, to have a stake in the country, and to be free. And the third big strain of this, the cultural side of things, as Morgan argues, was that it was the view at the time that people had as much responsibility as they had land. You kind of had more gravitas if you were a vast landowner. It's actually part of the reason why George Washington was so popular to be the leader of the newly independent America. He was literally the richest man in 13 colonies. He owned vast estates and hundreds of slaves. Secondly, the reason for why owning property meant owning people as well. We need to kind of drill into that. It's not just enough to have the first question. We can go a bit further in our answer. And there was this view that if you own all this land, someone needs to work on the land, right? Someone needs to plant the crops that make you rich when you have the land. You can't do it yourself if you have enough. There was no large urban landless poor population in America. There was in Britain. Most of the people living in London didn't own land. They were tenants who worked in the factories. But that population didn't exist. Someone needed to work for you if you were a prominent land-owning businessman in America. And so the Americans turned to slavery. They found it easier to forcibly import people and enslave them to work than to persuade landless poor people in Britain to make this very perilous crossing 5 weeks across the Atlantic to America to then just be landless and poor again in America. No one wants to do that, right? So they turned to slavery instead. And it is important to note that there's the economic political side of things. So you can say stuff like, there was fear of insurrection, which meant that there was a tightening control over labor. That's why we see, do you remember that trend from the last talks of indentured servitude becomes slavery as they're afraid of the landless poor population from rising up. They tighten control over them. And that's easier to do to non-white people than white people. So they could do it to black people and Native Americans instead. But also it's important to note that slavery was a cultural institution as well as an economic and political institution. Though it had economic roots, racism becomes a thing in this period. And it is easier to distinguish between free and unfree people if you have it along racial lines where, everyone who's unfree is black and everyone who's free is white, for example. And this is kind of a tangent, but you can see how we've had to get here from the start of what does freedom mean. So to the founding fathers, freedom meant the liberty to own property and therefore have a stake in the nation and therefore be economically independent and free from debt. There's a big fear of debt in this period. And that meant in many ways to them, and though it seems crazy to us now and to a lot of people in the time as well, that meant the liberty to own other people, to own slaves, to engage in slavery. So that's what freedom meant to them. But what did freedom mean to the black people who lived in America? It may not be a shock to you to know that there wasn't a big monolith of opinion. It's not like all black people in America, obviously they all wanted to not be slaves anymore, but whether or not they all wanted to be independent from Britain or to be a part of Britain, there's a big divide in African American opinion. There were a lot of African Americans who fought for independence from Britain. Names like, for example, Crispus Attucks, who was the first person to die, literally fought in the barricades and died for America. But also we have people like Peter Salem and Salem Poor, who fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. They won medals for their bravery in fighting. Or Prince Estabrook, or the aforementioned Cato, people who were spies, who spied on the Brits, Americans. And there were thousands of Americans, 9,000 Americans who joined the Patriot cause, African Americans, to fight alongside them. About 4% of all the people fighting in the war itself. They fought for the independent America because, at the beginning at least, both sides, loyalists and patriots, promised if you fight for us, we'll give you freedom. Now, as the war went on, the Americans began to roll back on that promise And as we'll see later, they began to enslave people, re-enslave people who had been previously promised their freedom. Meanwhile, on the British side, remember that 9,000 figure for the Americans? 20,000 enslaved people, African Americans, free and enslaved, joined the British cause. Twice as many. Obviously, it's not all one side. It's 2/3, 1/3, just by the sheer numbers who actually, joined one side specifically. We don't know the people who just thought that they were in favor of one side or another. There is no census data on that front. But we know that twice as many fought for the Brits. And that's because, in much more concrete terms, they were promised their freedom if they would fight for the crown. And in fact, we have what was called Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, kind of weirdly named, but that was a regiment of black people, and they were in Virginia, told, if you run away from your plantation and join us, we'll give you our freedom. They're pictured here, at least one of their soldiers is. That's the only picture I could find of them. And they fought for the crown for most of the year. This is not to say that the Brits are all hardcore anti-racists fighting against those mean Americans. Lord Dunmore received quite a lot of flack for arming black people in America. He got told off for it, but he did it anyway. And it was eventually accepted as a successful policy to get people fighting on the side. However, it kind of backfired because the notion of freeing slaves and giving them guns was terrifying to a lot of the most prominent Americans. And so it really, as that South Carolina guy argued before, actually stopped the Americans from turned a lot of loyalists into patriots, if you will. But yes, there were a lot of black people who fought on both sides. There was no one monolith of opinion, and they fought on both sides and were often seen as heroes on both sides, fighting and dying for the cause that they saw was important. So now it's time to talk about Hamilton. And there is a really good article by Lyra Monteiro, who was a historian who wrote for the journal, The Public Historian, unsurprisingly. And the article is entitled Race-Conscious Casting and the Erasure of the Black Past in Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, which I really recommend you read if you have the opportunity. It's free, available online. It's only 10 pages long. It's not huge. And a bit of background, for those of you who have been living under a rock for the last 10 years, or if you just aren't into musicals that much, Hamilton is a musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda, which came out in 2016, I believe, telling the story of Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury in the new Republic of USA, and his life and times, how he fought in the Revolution, and his eventual fall and death in a duel to Aaron Burr. Excuse me. And it was famous for a variety of reasons. One, it's extremely well written. Certainly when I first listened to it and watched it, I completely fell in love with it. That's a good disclaimer. I really, really liked it for a very long time. It's written not like traditional musicals like Les Mis or something. It's written almost as a rap opera. It features a lot of like black music styles. And in terms of casting, as you can see in front of you, there are almost no white actors except for the person who plays the King George III of Britain. He's a white actor. Everyone else is a black actor, or Hispanic, or Asian. So it's a very diverse cast. Well, I guess it's almost not diverse because there's almost no white actors in it, but it's got non-white performers, which is cool as well. It is very much celebrated for that. But Lyra Monteiro, who is herself an African-American woman, and a variety of other historians have taken issues with it. The radio tagline for the adverts for Hamilton, telling you to buy it, says, "This is the story of America then, told by America now." And there are two things assumed by that statement. Firstly, it's that America now is this young, cool, diverse place where almost no one's white. And secondly, it's that America then was this white place, it's white history. Every character in the entire musical, barring, I believe, one cast member portrays a slave briefly in the background, but except for her, every other character in this show is white. So it implies that was the history of America, the past is white. But that's both, neither of those are necessarily true. Okay, yes, America is very diverse, but obviously there are lots of white people in America now. But the really important point is that second one, the idea that America then was all these white people running around doing things, making proclamations and fighting for independence or against independence. And that's just not true. The show is about the acts of capital G, capital W, capital M, great white men doing things. And the show basically ignores slavery as an important institution and one important for America at the time. There's a few mentions of it, but it really doesn't talk about how most of the protagonists, George Washington is portrayed as this big hero, how he had loads of slaves, for example. And it doesn't really make any black historical actors important characters in the musical. And that's kind of weird, considering the goal of the musical, right? What is the goal of the musical? Because a lot of the actors in the musical, Leslie Odom Jr., for example, who portrays Thomas Jefferson, says that he really feels like he's reclaiming the past and presenting it to a wider audience. There are issues with this as well. It's estimated that I believe 80% of the people who actually saw the musical in Broadway were white. But if he feels that it's reclaiming the past, then that must have some merit and some value. And I'm very glad that he feels that way. But I do think there is still an issue with the fact that, how can I phrase this? This is still, in many ways, if you ignore who's been cast, this is still a white story made for a white audience and telling the story of white people doing things. This is not a Black history of America. I would not include it as a primary source or a secondary source in my talks, aside from the casting, but I think it's interesting to engage with it critically. And so, do we like Hamilton? Well, I think as a work of art, in terms of how it was written, it's very cleverly written and the story is really engaging and interesting. And I would recommend you listen to it if you haven't yet. But I don't think it is an amazing example, a shining example of showing the Black past of America, which I think is a shame because it really could have done that. I don't think, worth mentioning, I don't think it's uniquely bad. I'm not saying that you can't like Hamilton and you should feel bad if you do. I think that would be ridiculous. Because it's telling a similar story to the mainstream narrative of what happened in the past of America, that it was figures like Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, Hercules Mulligan, all these people who signed the Declaration of Independence and created the new nation of America. It continues that narrative. It's not doing something uniquely bad. It's not doing something uniquely good, which makes me sad because I think it could have. But anyway, do we think American independence was good? I know it definitely feels like I've been, maybe this is the British bias of me giving this talk, saying that really the Americans were better off under the British Empire and they should have just stayed with us. I don't think that's the case. It's worth mentioning that Americans at the time saw this contradiction between freedom and slavery. In 1774, Abigail Adams, who married John Adams, another of these big founding fathers, she wrote, "It always appeared a most iniquitous scheme to me to fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering from those who have as good a right to freedom as we have." So saying, how can we fight for freedom when we're plundering and robbing African Americans? So it's not the case that everyone in this picture was evil. That's not what I'm trying to say. And it is definitely true that in some places, with some people gained a degree of freedom, right? And we'll talk more about this and what the implications of the American Revolution were. But a lot of people genuinely believed, not everyone in America owned slaves. In fact, comparatively few people, less than half did. And a lot of people really believed that they were fighting for freedom and liberty from the oppressive thumb of the British Empire. The famous slogan, "Give me liberty or give me death." People weren't winking to their friends as they said that. They truly believed they were fighting for their independence from this oppressive British regime. In 1770, you remember way back at the beginning of this talk when we talked about the Boston Massacre, at the time that was happening, 1 in 3 people living in Boston were soldiers. Like in many ways, the British government was being quite oppressive and authoritarian in its relationship to the Americans. And certainly when the Americans tried to push towards freedom and they wanted representation, no taxation without representation being their big slogan. If you're going to tax us, give us members of parliament, give us a voice in the running of our own nation. The Brits outright refused and said no and sent in the troops instead to crush them rather than listening to them. So I'm not saying that the Americans were bad. I'm not saying they're good either, though. I don't think it's useful to think of these kinds of things and give this kind of binary answer of this was good or this was bad. I think we should understand that there are these really long-term processes of racial hierarchies, of slavery, of freedom, of people trying to control each other or fight for independence or own land or own people even as well. And I'm afraid, though it's not an easy answer, and it's not as simple as me telling you, I give you permission to shout at Americans and tell them they're bad for being independent from Britain. I don't think we really can do that. I don't think it's that simple. So to conclude, and I have a picture here of James Lafayette, who was another one of these Black American patriots. It is definitely true to say what we can take away from this is that the founding fathers of America fought for a very, this is the thing to put down in your notes for the quiz afterwards. There won't be a quiz, don't worry. The founding fathers of America fought for a very specific type of freedom, and it's freedom as they understood it at the time. The freedom to gain property, for it not to be taxed away from you or have British soldiers living in it. So that kind of freedom, that kind of liberty. And there was less space in that struggle for that kind of freedom for Black people. When people are fighting for their freedom to keep you as a slave, who do you fight for? But even though there wasn't that kind of ideological framework for them, they took part in it anyway. And tens of thousands of African Americans fought on both sides of the American Revolutionary War for liberty, as for the Patriots or for the Crown, for the Loyalists, for reasons that seemed clear to them. You know, either they are fighting for the promise of freedom from the Brits or for the promise of a new and free America. And we'll see in later talks if either of those promises ever get realized. And finally, and this is the most important point really to take away from this, is that I think we should be very careful in the way that we understand the causes for the American Revolutionary War and the actors, the people taking part in it, and why they were doing what they were doing, and the goals they hoped to achieve, and the things that they were most scared of, and the reasons why they fought. And really, in a sense, almost everyone on both sides of the revolution were fighting for what they saw as freedom for themselves. I guess maybe not the redcoats so much. They were fighting to keep people in the empire. So maybe not everyone, but certainly a lot of people on both sides were fighting for what they saw as freedom. And for our final image, before I ask if anyone has any questions, and I can see there might be a few, this is a lot of topics touched upon. We have this famous picture. It's one of the most famous pictures to symbolize the American Revolutionary War. And it has George Washington crossing the Delaware River to surprise the British garrisons and win one of the first major victories for the Patriots in the entire war. And in true American fashion, this painting was painted by a German, and it depicts Washington alongside, as we can see, the third from the left person is a Black patriot. In the middle there, on the holding the oar towards the right, is a woman disguised as a man so she can fight. And at the very back, manning the tiller, is a Native American. And so even though in many ways this is a painting taken to show the great white man, Washington, and other founding fathers fighting for their freedom, it's sneakily, in another way, very really tells the story of America, of people from all walks of life coming together to achieve, in their own way, what they saw as a fight for freedom. And yeah, with that, does anyone have any questions? And there are some coming in already. I can see on the Zoom. I'm just going to check YouTube as well. I'll take a sip of water before I answer some of these questions. They all look very good. 1 second. So, first question is, what happened to the enslaved people who fought for the British? What did their freedom look like? Land, education, legal rights? This is a really, really good question. And in fact, it's such a good question that in 2 talks' time, basically the entire talk will be focused on that. What was the fate of the Black Loyalists and the Black Patriots? What was the fallout of the revolution like for them? To give you the very brief view, a lot of different things happened, but there's at least one story which we'll be focusing on a lot, which is very, very weird, where they fled to Canada first. Nova Scotia is where a lot of them ended up. And from there, they said, no, we want land that's better than this stuff. So then they went across the Atlantic to London, and there was a large London Black population for a while. And they took a Civil War pension and lived in their subculture in London until eventually it was agreed that they should be shipped off to Africa and they ended up crossing the Atlantic again, this time south rather than going east, and ended up in Sierra Leone, and were some of the first British colonies on the continent of Africa, in a kind of repatriation, even though most of them had never seen Africa before. They were second or third generation immigrants to America. So all over the place, a variety of different interesting things happened to them. And yeah, we're going to talk about that in more detail in a month's time. I have another question. Do you know, did the Brits tax Americans more or less than some of their other colonies? Were other colonies aware, and were they supportive of the revolution? That is a very good question. And excuse me one second, sorry. The interesting point to make here is that the British Empire in the 18th century was actually quite a lot smaller than it would later grow to be. For example, Britain did not rule over India in this period. It did not rule over Australia or New Zealand or almost any of Africa at all. The British colonies largely extended to Caribbean islands, 13 colonies in America and Canada as well. And the other colonies is mostly the Caribbean colonies at this point, and they were a lot more profitable and had a lot fewer people living in them than when compared to the 13 colonies. And also they were, I'm trying to work out how to phrase this. Yeah, so in essence, the Brits actually basically taxed the Americans, the 13 colonies Americans, less than other colonies. The ones like Jamaica and Barbados, they were taxed quite a lot more heavily because they were making all the money for the British Empire. And so the Americans had this salutary, what was it called? Salutary neglect for centuries. And so there was actually quite a lot less support than you might expect from other colonies in the region, because they didn't really know what the Americans were complaining about so much. And so they weren't actually that supportive. Although people who did support the American colonies in their fight for independence, which we'll see in 2 weeks' time, were other European powers, the Dutch, the Spanish, the French, particularly the French. They were really, really involved, where everyone saw an opportunity to screw over Britain, shall we say. And so really, really helped out the American revolutionaries to the extent where they probably wouldn't have succeeded if it wasn't for the outside assistance. So that's that. I have another question. Where did the expression liberty or death come from? So it's a speech by Patrick Henry, who was one of these big patriots. Give me liberty or give me death. He made it to the Second Virginia Convention in 1775 in Virginia. And it was one of his stirring speeches in favor of revolution. There's a lot of these. And there's another one. Thomas Paine wrote a book called Common Sense, where he laid out the reasons for why Britain should be independent. And there's a lot of really good intellectual movements and people making great speeches and writing great books for the cause of American independence. I have a question. Can you repeat the name of the author? Who wrote the criticism of Hamilton? Her name is, if I can bring my notes up, you can peek behind the curtain and see I keep my notes on my phone, which is why I can read quotations offhand. It's not that I'm just amazingly good at memorizing things. Don't worry, I'm human like everyone else. Her name is Lyra Monteiro. I'm just going to put it in the chat because it's not immediately obvious how that's spelt. Monteiro. Lyra Monteiro. Oh, actually, post that publicly. Sorry. As I said, she wrote this really good article for Public Historian about her criticisms of Hamilton. She's actually quite a lot more scathing than I am. I suppose I had the reaction when I first listened to the musical. I really, really liked it. And there was a period in my life where I could basically quote the entire musical offhand, which I can no longer do. So I really 100% fell head over heels in love with it because it's so rare to get a historical work of art that's really popular. Whereas I think she kind of hated it from day one. And so in her review is very, very rude about it. It's quite funny. So I would recommend that if you want to have a bit of a chuckle. I always love watching academics be scathing in kind of highfalutin academic language, but being very critical of something always makes me chuckle to see. Yeah, I would recommend that. And also in terms of spreading news, you may have noticed from my early bit where I was describing the Boston Massacre that things don't change that much, and that story could have come from a variety of time periods. And if hearing that story and the fact that in some ways, obviously in a lot of ways, things have changed a lot in the last 300 years, but in some ways things haven't changed that much, and you are compelled to action, then I recommend looking into the Equal Justice Project initiative, which is a campaign in America that tries to end police and other violence against Black people in the US. So if you hear that kind of story and think, this is terrible, what can I do? Look into those kinds of organizations, because they're doing really good work to try and make sure that we stop hearing these kinds of stories of state security, law enforcement, shooting unarmed Black people. Happened in 1770 and it keeps happening. Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions? I know that got a little bit heavy for a second, and I apologize for that. But if anyone has questions of any other kind, you can ask on YouTube as well, or on the Zoom chat. People should be able to unmute themselves. Let me just check on that front. Yeah, people can unmute themselves if they want. You don't have to ask questions, of course, but now is the time. I have another one saying, why was the stamp tax so important? Yes, I did say I would talk more about that, in fact. It was seen as culturally and intellectually outrageous. It's weird because now in most countries in the world, one of the main sources of tax actually is income tax and VAT, value-added tax, where whatever you buy or whatever income you make, that gets taxed and sent to the government. That wasn't how it was done. Individual goods would be taxed. They'd put in a tobacco tax or a land tax or that kind of thing. That was true for most of this period. And so when the Brits imposed stamp duty and started taxing any forms of paper, this is seen as outrageous because paper was the currency of civilization, to put it in a very grandiose way. That means you're taxing all books and pamphlets and letters people are writing to each other, and you're taxing ideas being spread, because ideas are spread on paper in this time. We haven't got the internet yet, right? So people saw it as strangling the lifeblood of burgeoning American intellectualism, and so a lot of people who wrote these kinds of pamphlets were extremely outraged with the thought of a stamp duty. And the same goes for taxations on alcohol and stuff. Those always got massive protests, but for possibly slightly less highbrow reasons. I have another question. Did slaves that supported the British get punished after the war? That is another very good question, and the one that we're going to look at a little bit later as well in later talks. But in general, in broad strokes, whoever you were, if you had fought in, I guess there's kind of two parts to my answer here, because most people that supported the British, when the war was coming to a close, it wasn't this, and we'll talk about more in 2 weeks' time as well. Sorry, whenever you're doing it's a multi-part talk, and there's only the first of 3 about the American Revolution, so I don't want to keep saying we'll hear about this later. I don't want to just tempt you and tantalize you. I do want to answer questions, but we will talk about it later as well. As the Brits began to lose the war, as the loyalists began to lose the war, it wasn't like they lost all at once and were suddenly massacred. They slowly pulled out and pulled back from the American colonies. And so as they retreated, the Black people who had supported the British were able to retreat with them, and for the most part were able to run away into Canada, back to Britain, into wherever else the hell the Black loyalists ended up going after the war. So for the most part, they didn't actually end up back in America. It's not always true though. And for those that did, in fact, it didn't really matter. Some were executed if they were captured. Same goes for British soldiers who were captured. Some were executed or imprisoned. But for the most part, they were just simply re-enslaved and sent back to work on plantations, which, I guess it's no worse than your life was before the war, but it must really have sucked to have had a couple of years of relative independence and being able to, move around and fight for your freedom, and then losing it all. That must have been really, really awful. I do think. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? Someone has unmuted their mic. Is that phone thing? If not, yeah. I mean, now is your final chance, anyone, to ask any questions at all. And if not, that's all right. We will be picking up in 2 weeks' time with the war itself, the Revolutionary War itself, and we'll ask the question and dive in a little more in depth on this. What was the American Revolution like for Black people? What was their experience? We talked a bit about what kind of people joined up and that kind of stuff. We'll get more into it and more into the goings on of the revolution and why it was the Americans were successful in the end. How could these random farmers in the 13 colonies defeat this big British Empire? And talk about that. Are there any other news? If you're watching this after the fact and you're not watching it live, you can ask a question on YouTube and I will get back to you and reply. So go ahead and do that. Same goes for, I'm on 49 subscribers on YouTube and I'd quite like to get to 50. So I only need one more, and I've been one away for like weeks now. And it's terrible. It's not actually, it's just an arbitrary number, but it'd be cool to get to 50. So if you like this video and want to see more, obviously you know what to do. And thank you everyone else for watching this talk so far. And I hope to see you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucas.
Very interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thanks.
Very. Thank you.
See you guys in 2 weeks. Bye.